Back then, I was 25 and freshly moved to this small town that seemed to be stuck in time, with just a grocery store, a post office, and an old vintage toy shop that felt like it belonged in another era. I had just left behind the chaos of the city after a marketing gig fell apart. Turns out, trying to make it big was more about drowning than swimming. I found myself in this sleepy place, renting a room over a garage and spending my evenings figuring out what came next. That's how I ended up at the toy store. Old Time Toys, that was the name. Not exactly creative, but it fit the place perfectly. It was the kind of store that looked like it never quite left the 50s. Creaky wooden floors, dusty shelves lined with toy soldiers, dollhouses, and wind-up trains that never seemed to work. The boss, Mrs. Thompson, was a quiet woman in her 60s, kind enough to offer me a job without too many questions about my past. It was small-town kindness. I'd been working there for about a month, mostly stocking shelves, ringing up the occasional customer, and making sure nothing was falling apart more than it already was. It was early October. I remember because the air was crisp, and people had started coming in to ask about Halloween decorations. Mrs. Thompson had asked me to close up alone for the first time. She said it like it was no big deal, but I felt this nervousness in my gut. Probably just because it was new, I told myself. I spent that whole afternoon reorganizing the shelves, mindlessly adjusting things that didn't need adjusting, trying to feel like I had some control. And then there was aisle 6. I'd been through all the aisles already, but there it was, almost hidden behind a few outdated board games. A doll. Not just any doll, either. This one looked wrong. It had a porcelain face, pale and cracked in places, and black eyes that seemed too large. Its faded red dress had this Victorian flair that wasn't charming, just eerie. And I swear I hadn't seen it earlier in my shift. The tag hanging around its neck was blank. No price, no maker, nothing. Not the sort of thing we carried, but Mrs. Thompson had a habit of picking up antiques from estate sales and never mentioning it, so I assumed it was just something new she hadn't logged yet. Still, the thing creeped me out. I decided it didn't belong out front, so I took it to the back room. Our back room was a chaotic mess, boxes piled on top of boxes, with old toys that no one wanted anymore. I stuck the doll on top of a stack and got out of there quickly, my skin prickling as if I could feel the doll's gaze even with my back turned. I went back to aisle 6, trying to pretend like nothing had happened. An hour later, I was closing in on quitting time. I was getting ready to lock up, but something felt off. It was too quiet, the kind of silence that weighed on you. And then I heard it. This tiny sound, almost like giggling. It was soft, barely there, and seemed to come from deep inside the store. I stopped, my heart suddenly pounding, telling myself it was just the old building settling. I turned toward the back room, and the door was slightly ajar. I knew I had closed it. I took a step closer, feeling my throat tighten, and then I saw it. The doll was back in aisle 6. My stomach dropped. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I stared at it. How the hell did it get back out here? I forced myself to move, to pick it up again. The porcelain felt cold against my skin, and I carried it, gingerly, like it was made of something far more fragile than it looked. Back to the storage room. I put it on the same stack of boxes, muttering to myself, "Stay put, all right?" My voice sounded shaky, even to me. I pulled the door shut firmly, then locked it. I walked back to the front, but the air still felt heavy. It was almost time to lock up, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to laugh at myself. An old doll? Really? But that sound, that whispering, that giggling, it started again. Louder this time, echoing off the shelves, moving around me like a child playing hide and seek. My heart was thundering, my palms were slick with sweat, and the lights seemed to flicker, the shadows growing longer, darker. I turned to the front door, ready to get out of there, but the lock wouldn't budge. It was like it had fused in place. I jiggled it, cursing under my breath, trying to keep calm. And then I saw them. Tiny footprints, smudged on the dusty wooden floor, leading from aisle 6 toward the storage room. My vision narrowed, and I felt a chill run down my spine that settled like ice in my stomach. I had to know. I couldn't leave without knowing. My feet moved before my brain could catch up, and suddenly I was in front of the storage room door. My hand shook as I turned the key, the lock clicking open in the silence. I swung the door wide, and there it was. The doll was lying on its side, its black eyes staring at me, and there was something in its hand, a tiny slip of paper. I bent down, my breath caught in my throat, and I read the words written in shaky, childlike scrawl. "I'm still here." Panic took over. I didn't think. I grabbed the doll and smashed it against the ground, the porcelain shattering into shards that scattered across the floor. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short gasps, but the air seemed to ease. The weight lifted. I walked to the front door, and this time, the lock turned easily. I stumbled out into the chilly October night, gulping the cold air like I had been underwater. I didn't tell Mrs. Thompson. I didn't tell anyone. It felt too strange, too unreal. The next day, I almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, until I walked into the store for my next shift. There, on the shelf in aisle 6, was the doll, perfectly intact. Its black eyes seemed to follow me as I stood frozen in place. Later, I found out about the child. Mrs. Thompson mentioned it casually one day, how a little girl had gone missing decades ago, right here in this store. She'd been with her mother, and then she was just gone. No trace, no leads, just vanished. They said she loved dolls. And now I can't help but wonder, is she still here, waiting, playing, looking for someone to notice her? All I know is I never worked another closing shift again. Story 2. I got hired as the manager for Toy World. I was 34, freshly unemployed after the company I worked for downsized, and I needed something to keep my life together. Toy World seemed perfect. Big franchise, good pay, cheerful environment. I even loved the holiday season rush, that chaotic blend of laughter, crying kids, and the scent of plastic and cardboard. It all seemed fun back then, before I found the hidden room. It started a few weeks before Christmas. The store was packed, aisles full of plush toys, action figures, and frazzled parents on the hunt for the it toy of the season. I was doing inventory late one night, alone except for our security guy, Greg, who was posted at the front entrance. That's when I found it. A door hidden behind a shelf of oversized plush bears. The thing had clearly been there forever, but it was tucked away where no customer or employee would think to look. It was locked though, and I was curious. Curious enough that I started looking around for a key. A couple days later, I was going through my office drawer, a messy place full of old receipts, manuals, and stuff left behind by my predecessor. I found a key there, a small brass one, labeled with some code I didn't recognize. My curiosity won out. One quiet afternoon, while everyone was out front dealing with a delivery, I decided to try it. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dark room. The light from the hallway barely reached inside, but I could make out walls covered from floor to ceiling with drawings, crayon scrawls on almost every inch of the space. It was unnerving, to say the least. They looked like the kind of drawings a kid would make. Stick figures, animals, basic houses. But as I stepped further in, the images shifted. They got darker. The stick figures looked like they were cowering from something, hiding or running. There were big black scribbles in the corners, shadowy figures standing over the houses. One phrase kept repeating in that shaky, childish handwriting, "Don't let him in." I tried joking about it with Greg later that day, but he just went pale and changed the subject. He wouldn't look me in the eye. It was like the room had its own kind of secret that no one wanted to touch. The next week, I couldn't stay away from the room. Something about it drew me in. I'd go in during my breaks, just staring at the drawings, feeling a chill each time I noticed a new detail I hadn't before, like a pair of eyes drawn inside one of the windows, or tiny figures that seemed to grow more scared as I studied them. The place felt wrong. The smell of the room, a musty, damp scent, lingered on me every time I left, and it stuck in my nose long after I'd gone home. Then, one night, it all came to a head. We were closing up after a late holiday rush. It was just me and Greg again. He was up front, counting the till while I did my rounds, making sure everything was where it should be. I was passing by the plush toys, aisle 9, when I saw it. A figure, just standing there, by the hidden door. I couldn't make out a face, just a shape. Tall, too still. My heart jumped, and I shouted, thinking it was someone who'd stayed behind, but the figure didn't move. I ran towards it, my shoes squeaking against the tile, but by the time I reached the aisle, it was gone. The door to the hidden room was open, though. The lights flickered, and my stomach twisted. I stood in the doorway staring into the darkness, listening. The room was silent. I could barely make out the drawings, the crayon figures staring back at me, their eyes wide, filled with something like terror. I don't know why, but I stepped inside. It felt like the walls were closing in around me. I turned, my flashlight bouncing off the scribbles, and then I saw it. A new drawing, right in the middle of the wall. It was different, more detailed. It was a person, standing in the toy store, wearing a name tag. My name tag. The letters were drawn in shaky, uneven lines, but it was clear. It was me. And beneath it, scrawled hastily, almost an afterthought, "He's next." I stumbled back, almost dropping my flashlight. Panic clawed at my chest, my breathing shallow. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't bother locking it. I ran up front, grabbed my stuff, and told Greg I was done for the night. He looked at me, eyes wide, like he knew, like he understood something I didn't. I quit a week later. I never went back. I heard from another old coworker that Greg left not long after I did. He didn't say why. No one ever talks about that room or what's behind that door. But I still dream about it sometimes. About the figures, about the words, about that crude drawing of me, alone in the toy store, with something lurking just behind. Story 3. You know, I used to think haunted toys were just some dumb story you'd tell around a campfire. I was 22, broke, and desperate enough to pick up a night shift job at Toys and More. It wasn't exactly my dream gig, but student loans don't wait for dreams. The store was massive. Aisles and aisles of toys that no kid in their right mind would want. Stuffed animals staring blankly out, the lingering scent of rubber and plastic. It always felt a bit sad in there, especially after hours, when all the lights were dimmed except for the overhead security ones, casting long shadows over the displays. I remember it was a Wednesday night, sometime in November, the wind howling against the store windows. There weren't many customers in the late hours, so I had a lot of time to myself. I was restocking some boxes up on the high shelves when I found them. An old set of walkie-talkies, hidden behind a row of unboxed dolls. They looked ancient, not something our store even sold anymore. The kind with the long antennas that almost poke your eye out if you aren't careful. I brought them down, curious. They had the word AdventureCom written in faded letters on the side. One of them was busted, the plastic cracked near the speaker, but the other seemed intact. I fiddled with the dials, not expecting much. To my surprise, the thing clicked on, broadcasting a wash of static. I smiled, almost amused. There was something oddly nostalgic about that crackling sound, reminding me of when my brother and I used to play with these as kids, pretending we were spies. But this time, the static was different. It wasn't just a buzz. Beneath it, I could swear I heard something else, like a whisper, faint, almost blending in with the noise. I held it closer, pressing the button, half joking. "Hello? Anyone out there?" I waited, expecting silence. Instead, the static shifted, and a voice, soft, almost too quiet to hear, whispered back, "Hello." I froze, my heart giving a small lurch. I looked around, half expecting one of my coworkers to be messing with me. But there was no one. The entire store was empty, just the hum of the AC and the muffled thuds of rain against the roof. I pressed the button again, my voice cracking a little. "Who is this?" The response was immediate, but what it said sent a chill down my spine. "You remember the park, don't you? The swings." I nearly dropped the walkie-talkie. The swings? The park? How could anyone know about that? I hadn't talked about that night in years. The time I fell off the swings when I was 8, scraped my knee so bad I still had the scar. My brother had to carry me home. It wasn't something I shared, not with anyone. I laughed it off at first, tried to convince myself I was just tired, that maybe it was picking up some weird frequency, like a radio prank or something. But the walkie-talkie wouldn't stop. That night, as I walked through the darkened aisles doing my rounds, I kept hearing it. Those whispers. Sometimes it was just static. Sometimes the voice would say my name. Sometimes it would mention things. Things only I knew. My stomach twisted every time I heard it. It was like it was reading my mind, pulling out the memories I'd buried deep. The worst was when it began asking for help. "I'm stuck," it would say. "Please help me." The voice was thin, almost like a child's, cracking through the static. And the more I ignored it, the more desperate it got. One night, I turned the walkie-talkie off completely, took the batteries out even, but it didn't stop. I could hear it, faintly, as if it was coming from the shadows of the aisles. I'd catch glimpses of something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement in a reflection, a shadow ducking out of sight. I was losing sleep, jumping at every small sound, every creak of the building settling. It felt like something was watching me, following me. One night after closing, I'd had enough. The voice was louder, almost frantic, begging me not to leave, saying it had waited too long. My hands were shaking as I took the walkie-talkie, went out to the back lot, and smashed it against the concrete. The plastic shattered, bits of antenna and wires scattering across the pavement. I stood there, breathing heavily, feeling a strange mix of fear and relief. It was over, I thought. It had to be. But the next morning, when I came in for my shift, there it was, sitting on the counter by the register, perfectly intact, like it had never been broken. New batteries. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as I stared at it. No one else seemed to notice. My coworker, Maria, walked past, giving me a cheerful, "Morning," like everything was normal. I picked it up, my fingers trembling, and that's when I saw it, scratched into the back, almost too faint to notice. "You can't leave me." No. Later, I found out about the guy who worked here before me. Maria mentioned it casually over lunch one day, how he was a quiet guy, used to love messing around with the old toys during his breaks. He died, she said. Some kind of accident. No one liked to talk about it much, but she remembered one thing clearly. He used to play with those same walkie-talkies during his last few weeks, always carrying one around, like he was waiting for someone to answer. I quit not long after that. Even now, years later, I still get chills whenever I see an old walkie-talkie at a garage sale or hear static on the radio. I still wonder, was it really just in my head? Or did someone really need my help, trapped in a place I couldn't reach? Story 4. Being a single mom isn't easy, especially when your life revolves around night shifts at a toy store and mornings getting your 6-year-old ready for school. The days blurred into each other back then. Exhausting, stressful, but necessary. I'd tell myself that things would eventually get better, that I'd save enough to find a better job, to move out of that cramped apartment. But for now, it was me, my daughter Hannah, and that night job at Toy Haven. Hannah never liked clowns. I mean, what kid does really? She'd seen one on TV when she was 4, a kid's movie, but it scared her enough that she'd cry whenever she saw even the cartoonish ones in toy stores. I understood. I hated clowns too, but I had to put on a brave face for her. When I started working at Toy Haven, I made sure to avoid the clown aisle, and especially the old mirror that sat at the end of it. That mirror was massive, taller than me, with a tarnished gold frame. It was supposed to make the aisle look bigger, or maybe it was just meant to keep kids entertained with their reflections. Either way, I learned to hate that mirror, and for good reason. It was late one Tuesday night. I was on closing shift, one of those shifts where every minute dragged like an hour. I had just finished rearranging a display of stuffed bears when I glanced towards the mirror at the end of the aisle. For a moment, I thought I saw something. It was quick, almost like a flicker, but it caught my eye. I paused, squinting down the aisle, and there it was. A clown standing just out of the main reflection. Its painted face turned slightly away, like it was watching something else. My heart stopped for a beat and I blinked. It was gone. There weren't any clown toys on display in that aisle, I was sure of it. I shook my head, tried to laugh it off. Just tired, I told myself. Night shifts can do that to you. The next few nights I kept my distance from that mirror, but it didn't matter. Every time I walked past it, I felt something. The hairs on my neck stood up. One night, I noticed a small clown figurine sitting right in front of the mirror. I picked it up, moved it back to where it belonged in another section of the store. But the next night, it was back. Closer to the mirror this time, facing it. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? It was a stupid toy store. These things happen, right? Toys get misplaced, kids move them, coworkers play dumb pranks. One night, I was the only one left in the store trying to close up quickly because Hannah had been sick and I wanted to get home to her. I was walking by the mirror again when I caught another glimpse. This time, I stopped dead in my tracks. The store was empty, darkened with just the emergency lights on, but in the mirror I could see him. The clown, standing right behind me. His smile was wide, painted in red, his eyes locked on me, though there was nothing when I turned around. Just empty aisles. My skin went cold, and I felt that sinking, nauseating dread settle in my gut. I forced myself to turn away, to look away from the mirror. It wasn't real, I tried to convince myself. It couldn't be real. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, barely there, but unmistakable. Laughter too, giggling that echoed across the aisles. I'd be stacking shelves, and I'd hear it. The faintest sound, a childlike giggle. I'd look up, my heart pounding, and see nothing. The worst part was when I heard it call my daughter's name. Hannah, it whispered, like a breath against my ear. I turned so fast I nearly knocked over a shelf of board games, but again, nothing. Just the dim, empty aisles and the soft hum of the ceiling lights. That was the breaking point. The whispers, the glimpses. I couldn't ignore it anymore. That final night, I'd had enough. I took a deep breath, walked up to that damned mirror and stared into it. The reflection seemed wrong, off somehow. It wasn't just me. The store around me looked darker, empty in a way that made my stomach churn. And there, behind me, I saw him again. The clown. He was closer this time, his smile wider, his eyes blacker, empty. I grabbed a metal display hook from one of the aisles and swung it as hard as I could. The mirror shattered, the pieces exploding across the floor, shards skittering under shelves. I stood there, breathing heavily, the adrenaline making my hands shake. The laughter stopped, and for a moment I thought it was over. But as I looked down, I saw them. The shards of glass, scattered across the floor. They were still reflecting that face, the clown's face, staring up at me from every single piece. No matter how I turned, how I moved, the reflection stayed the same. That painted smile, those hollow eyes. The next day, I tried to pretend like it never happened. I came in for my shift, the mirror replaced with some generic poster about a sale. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could move past it. But then my coworker, Jake, mentioned something over coffee. He told me about a guy who used to work at Toy Haven. Funny guy, he said. Always dressed up for the promotions. You know, in a clown costume. He disappeared, Jake told me. Just vanished one day after his shift. The last place anyone saw him? Near that old mirror. I quit a week later. Moved out of town with Hannah, found a different job. But even now, whenever I pass by a mirror at night, I can't help but look out of the corner of my eye, just to make sure no one else is there, smiling back at me.